What's up, gang? So my throat is starting to hurt, so I'm going to just try and see if I can get through some of these, and hopefully, those of you that are not going to be here tomorrow can see this as well. All this information is should be like pretty fluid, and you've kind of already understood it. Let me move my guy. Where am I going? I'm going over here. All right. So this is considered the second industrial revolution. You got coal, iron, backbone of the industrial revolution. All this should sound familiar, especially from the first one. Oil, steel, electricity are kind of like the new backbone of the second one. And of course, we have people that we can kind of identify in those three areas. Technological advances and all this are coming forth. So railroads play this major production. Obviously, we've had them since about 1830, but it's not till Civil War you notice that the tracks and the mileage that's coming through. So with steel coming in, obviously that's going to be a major production for steel. They're going to have to work together to make sure they have all the right equipment and all that stuff. With railroads brings other things. We know it pushes people west. We know more people, more land, everything's moving there. It creates a national market for all goods because the stuff can get from East Coast to West Coast. It leads to larger corporations with massive profits because now they're moving more markets. Means that it can be bigger, and which means more factories, which means more workers, and all this fun stuff. Then that creates corporations, and eventually we have corporations selling stocks. All this should sound somewhat familiar because that's kind of what we do now. Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Railroad was an important railroad corporation in the northeastern U.S. That's somebody we hear of down here because of Vandy and all that stuff. So all this, like I said, should start connecting if you haven't figured that out yet. All right, steel. So during this time, remember Birmingham, we were founded because we were steel company or steel had all the resources to make steel within a not too far distance. And so what ends up happening is steel is needed for just think about everything that's steel because remember a lot of stuff was made with iron or other metals that aren't as strong. And steel is iron ore and other stuff, limestone and other items that are kind of built to make it stronger, which means you can build railroads, which means you can build skyscrapers. So skyscrapers mean that if I'm in New York or Chicago where room is limited, I can go up, I can build up. Iron, you couldn't do that. Steel is much stronger, so structures can build higher, which means they're definitely stronger. Obviously, railroads needed it because you had thousands of miles of track and continued thousands of miles of track. You saw from that last map I showed you from 1869 where the Transcontinental Railroad was, and then all the spurs that came off that thing after by the 1890s. That's going everywhere. And then obviously after 1890s, it just continued. So they continue to need steel produced in large amounts. Steel companies developed low-cost methods. So you talked about Carnegie and Homestead and the technology that he's relying on. As the price of steel fell, the industries such as construction began to use steel in their products, meaning that it was worth their while to try to build. Chicago becomes the very first place, the very first skyscraper in 1885. When I lived down there, there was a little plaque there showing you where that building was and all that. Large corporations, Carnegie Steel, which eventually becomes U.S. Steel. Our oil magnates and so forth. We got our buddy J.D. Rockefeller. Remember, prior to there was, oil was already coming out of the ground. People just didn't know what its use was, and eventually, you have Rockefeller and some of his friends who kind of developed a chemistry in regards to pulling kerosene out, and kerosene kind of changed the game because prior to using oil in lamps to produce heat and light, it was like whale blubber. And so this was an alternative from wood and whale blubber and all that. And it's something that they could get, out of the ground. So there was resources. And then obviously you had to use that ability to pull the kerosene out of the oil. Later on, we'll get gasoline, which means gasoline was a byproduct of this as well. And they're like, what are you going to do with this? Well, it turns out it'll run a car. So you start to see Rockefeller get involved. So to created, obviously, to have refineries, someone who changed oil into kerosene and other things. Oil was also used, if you want to think about it. Oil was used, lubrication and whatnot for machines and so forth. And remember, they needed steel and pipes and all that stuff. So they're also dealing with the steel companies and so forth. And of course, an example would be Standard Oil and John Rockefeller. Growth of railroads in the United States contributed to many different things. Companies produced materials that had to be shipped. And you would think, that the weird thing is that railroads caused time. We talked about that earlier, that they created standard times. They created time zones because remember, it has to get there and has to get there at a certain time. Plus, you also don't want wrecks of them running into each other. So time zones come about. But you'll notice that coal, steel, lumber, glass, textile, brakes, signals, all these things are coming about because of the railroad industry. All right, corporations, that's something we are somewhat familiar with. It is kind of the lasting 19th century. We're not talking about just stores and stuff. We're talking about big business, big corporations. So if you want an example, we've got railroads. So railroads, companies lobbied governments for subsidies. Those are government payments and sold shares of stocks. That means they're selling it to people. And so what's happening is they're able to expand. And when they're able to expand as a large corporation, like a Standard Oil, then professional managers had to be hired because it's getting more and more complex. And by being more complex, that means you have to hire like accounting firms and financial services because now you've got a lot of stuff in the air and you got to make sure that the company is cost effective and profitable. So if I'm a Carnegie or if I'm a Rockefeller, they can look at that ledger from the corporations and say, A, B, and C, and D is cost effective or not cost effective and to turn it profitable. That's why they say Carnegie and JP Morgan, these guys are really good because they had that capability to look at their ledgers and determine cost effectiveness and profitability. And we know, for example, Carnegie did that because he liked technology. He liked things coming about. Larger, more successful railroads bought smaller railroads, leading to market consolidation. That's when we're going to start to see monopolies where it's like it's the only choice for these people that they have. And so the railroads would buy up mom and pop railroads so they could have a full monopoly. And we're going to see that's going to cause trouble because then they have a monopoly of that rail line. So if my rail line is in Abilene, Texas, and I got to get my stuff to Chicago, and I've only got one railroad, which means I only have one owner, I have no access to any other railroad, which means they can charge me an arm and a leg just to get my stuff to Chicago. That's the problem the farmers have, is they're being taken advantage of, whereas John D. Rockefeller can look the railroad in the face and go, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to supply you, or I'm not going to put my oil trains on there because you're charging me too much. Give me a discount. All right, so a lot of the stuff that's kind of going on when we're talking about electricity and technology and so forth, you got Samuel Morse, that's the telegraph, using electronic signals, little tap, 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 taps. You got Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Eventually, they get out and about. These are more prominent and dominant in cities, in shorter distances in cities. Eventually, it does reach out to other places. My grandparents and when my parents grew up, like my dad grew up in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma, and they had what they called party lines. And what that meant was there was like one phone in everybody's house and they shared a line. So if you picked up the phone and somebody's already talking, that means that if there's like 15 families that have like one line, then someone was already using the phone. And you had to wait till that person got off, talk to the operator on the other side and say, hey, put me into the post office downtown, and they would have to link you into that particular line. So that's when you actually had telephone operators where they would put your line into the, say, post office because that's what you want to talk to. All right. Thomas Edison, he did not invent the electric light bulb. What he invented was the filament that we now still use. Or actually, we don't, we've gone to LED, but it was the filament, which means it would stay lit longer. You weren't just crashing through light bulbs pretty quickly. All All right, the rise of big business. So this is where we start talking about like the Gilded Age. So 1865 to basically the 1890s, almost 1900s. We know that Mark Twain kind of coined it. Gilded means gold plated. A gilded piece of jewelry appears to be of high value, but it's made of cheap material underneath. For example, if I had a lead cross and I decided to dip it in gold, that's called gilded. It's hiding the bad underneath. And so when you look at the Biltmore of Vanderbilt, and you're like, oh my goodness, everybody's rich, blah, 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 blah. Well, on the outskirts, you have, where Jacob Riis is showing us how other people have lived. This is where we get the argument. You may have seen that people go, are they robber barons or are they just captains of industry? And there's this giant debate all, up until this time frame, even today, talking about, are they just hunger-rich robber barons willing to do whatever they can to make a buck, or are they captains of industry? Did they create these corporations that caused the middle class, and they're bringing everybody with them? They're the technology leaders. They're the this. They're the that. So that's where this is what this section is talking about. You'll notice there's a YouTube clip. It is from an AP website, and it's about 5 minutes long, and it kind of goes into these captains of industry, these Vanderbilts, these Carnegies, these Rockefellers. Are they captains of industry, or are they just robber barons? Are they just trying to take the wealth and prey on small businesses and the working class? So trust and monopolies. So this is where we start to see people like Rockefeller get into trouble, because Rockefeller and Carnegie trade trust in an effort to form monopolies. A monopoly means there's no competition, that you're the only game in town. A trust is a group of separate companies placed under the control of a single managing board in an effort to create a monopoly. So they were trying to hide the fact that they were the same corporation, or they weren't trying to hide it. They're just saying they're separate corporations, but they belong in the same trust. So if you want to think about the trust is the umbrella that these companies are under, causing a monopoly. Two different types of monopoly are what they call integration. So horizontal occurs when, if you think about a line, horizon means, the sun, horizon. That's the easiest way to remember. The lines go this way. It would be two businesses that make the exact same thing merged together. So if Rockefeller was going to buy your gas station, that's horizontal. He's just buying up all the gas stations. Vertical means that you're going to own all the production within that market. For example, Carnegie does this a lot. But if you want to think about Ford Motor Company, they make the glass, they make the frame, they make the tires, they make all this stuff to make that Ford. They own all those productions of goods to finally form that car. That would be vertical. Steel production, smaller businesses struggle to compete with larger, because remember, a lot of the big boys are giving discounts. They're subsidized. They've got individual stock trading versus a mom and pop shop in the middle of nowhere, Alabama. It's hard to compete when everybody else kind of has access to other things, and then eventually they would just get bought up. So competition and consolidation. So investments lead to over-speculation and corruption. So somebody like a Jay Gould comes in and he stock watering. It means he inflates it. He's going to keep purchasing and buying. And his scheme was he created, like he faked. It's like if he had a copier and started printing all this fake stock and selling all this fake stock, and people were buying it up. He was stock watering, inflating the value of assets and profits of companies to sell in public. It's illegal. Railroad companies began to offer rebates and kickbacks to maintain competition. So rebates. So Rockefeller is going to get a rebate because they want his business. A kickback is they're paying him to use their services, maybe using all their services so that we would keep Rockefeller. Offers for large companies punish small farmers. So as I mentioned before, if I'm a small farmer in Abilene, Texas, I'm not going to get a discount. I'm going to have to pay full price, maybe even more, because there's only one show in town. There's no competition. So somebody like a Rockefeller who's getting a rebate or possibly a kickback to use that service, he can say, you know what? No, what I'll do is I'm going to help somebody build a railroad next to your railroad and knock you out of business, and I'm going to sit here and watch you do it. So what happens? Panic of 1893, we've talked about a couple of times. You see a quarter of the railroads went bankrupt. And we know by 1900, 7 companies controlled 2/3 of the railroads. That would be J.P. Morgan's. That made the system more efficient because we know how efficient these guys are, but only a few powerful men dominated the boards of competing railroad corporations. So it's easier if just one person owns it, because everything becomes standard. All times get fixed. All the small things get fixed. But now there's no competition, and it is what it is. And so you start to see that the same people, your Carnegies, your Rockefellers, all these people seem to be on the same boards of all these major corporations. So you got Vanderbilt, he was born poor. As I mentioned before, he got into the steamboat industry, eventually buys the New York Railroad, Central Railroad in 1869. He dies in 1877, so he doesn't last long in regards in that situation. But he does his job, and he does his job well. His assets are in about $200 million today, and the man's been dead since 1877. You got Rockefeller, Standard Oil, 1870. He had other companies before Standard Oil, so he actually gained all this other recognition before. Standard Oil is just the final product. He utilized trusts and cartels. We know that we had Harper's magazines and McGregor's all these different magazines coming out against him. Ida Turnbull and all of them talking about monopolies and trusts that he created, used it to his benefit. He owned 90% of the oil industry, so that's pretty much a pretty big monopoly. His assets would be worth about $400 billion today. So we've got all these different, Rockefeller and with his little crown on, and I mentioned the octopus. That's Standard Oil and Trusts that they got their hands and everything. Notice the tentacles around the Capitol buildings and the House, the Senate, and the White House. He looks like he's about to grab. Carnegie, Steel Company, 1892. We know he actually gained his money through railroad, but eventually gets into steel. We know eventually he will sell his steel to J.P. Morgan, create U.S. Steel. He would be at that point the richest man in the world. His assets would have been about $300 billion. At the end of his life, Carnegie donated most of his sums of money to the charitable causes. That's that gospel of wealth that as a Christian we all should be sending our money to the less fortunate. That's what he thinks. He is anti-imperialist. Let's give him that. All right, J.P. Morgan, him and his little shiny nose there, financer. Remember, the one thing that people disliked about that is they're not creating anything. The Europeans just didn't understand this. It's like they're not creating anything. They're just like buyers of business, and they're transactional businesses. Morgan was a financier, industrial organizer. Remember, his dad made a lot of money. He went off and actually proved himself and actually became richer than his dad. Eventually buys U.S. Steel from Carnegie and General Electric. So that's a biggie as well. Notice $25 billion. All right, so Teddy Roosevelt gets in. There's already some antitrust movement. Remember, the Sherman Antitrust Act comes out in 1890, but it's got no teeth. Matter of fact, it's being used mainly against the unions and not against monopolies, which it was created to do. And so you start to see that the middle class, the House, the Senate, and others are starting to push back against these trusts. It's not fair. You got old wealth versus nouveau rich, meaning old money versus new money. That's all that means. And you start to see middle class people realizing that they're kind of stuck. Yeah, they made it to the middle class, but they're like hung up. It's like we can't go anywhere because we're not part of this monopoly. We can't get involved in this trade. We can't move our production. We can't be movers and shakers in the world because we're stuck behind these monopolistic corporations. So the Sherman Antitrust Act prohibited organizations created with intent to regulate or control interstate trade or commerce. As I said before, mainly used against unions before it finally gets some teeth under Teddy Roosevelt. Notice that it says that weakened by the Supreme Court can only apply to manufacturing used primarily against labor unions. Did I just say that? All right, I got 2 more slides. I got social Darwinism. That's something we touched base on. Is 19th century wealth with a theory known as social Darwinism played on, like I said, it's not Charles Darwin's theme. It was used in regards to that. Um, Darwinists argued that wealth was a sign of a person's fitness, the result of natural selection. There will always be poor people, will always be rich people. It's basically the distinction between the two is you have go-getters and you have people that just don't care, and all that. It's a flawed line of reasoning because oftentimes there's racism and there's discrimination, and a lot of times this is being used to justify it. But this is a big program that's going on right now in the 1890s. All right, so consumerism. Okay, so who's buying all this stuff? Well, we got a middle class. We got people moving, urbanization. People are moving to the cities. People maybe moving to the burbs, and so you got department stores. Those are located in cities, and you got like Macy's, and you got some general stores in rural America like Sears and Roebuck. By the way, Sears and Roebuck was basically run out of a train out of Chicago. So if you bought some, you got a catalog, you ordered something, it came from the train and comes off the train and whatnot. Transportation, you got packaged foods for sale, Kellogg and Post. You got refrigerator cars from Swift. You got mass-produced meats and vegetables at highly competitive rate. So we had talked about how all these cowboys and farmers and all these people, where are they going for their food? Well, now they're going to the city or they're going to the market or whatever because it's faster and cheaper, which means it's going to shift everybody to urban areas, which means everybody's now going to be working in the city. And we'll see later on, everybody's working in the city and whatnot. And sometimes they move to the city and live in the city, and eventually people want to move to the burbs. So the middle class moves to the burbs. But right now you start to see advertising, the birth of consumer culture and shopping. We'll get to radios, which becomes the next big thing in regards to selling. Technology and entertainment. We're going to stop here. So everybody have a good weekend.